On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, White House saga continues. A fight between the parties and another reshuffle in the cabinet. And in our special series Witness to History, to mark China's reform and opening up, we speak to tech entrepreneur Dean Lei about innovation.
We spent 7 years to research the global platforms and design new model platforms for local China. So I think this is a very success.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. With the departure of John Kelly, Donald Trump has become the president with the most chiefs of staff within the first 2 years of taking office in the American history. The shakeup comes a day after Trump announced his nomination to fill two key positions, the Attorney General and the UN Ambassador. Take a look.
The White House shakeup continues. Last Saturday, Trump announced the departure of his latest chief of staff, John Kelly. This follows Nicki Haley's resignation in October and Jeff Sessions' firing the day after the midterms. Kelly will be leaving at the end of the year, and a successor is yet to be found. A few blocks from the White House,
hi everybody,
the State Department spokeswoman is on her way to a much bigger stage. Last Saturday, Trump nominated Heather Nauert to succeed Nicki Haley as the next U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. However, the choice is seen as a controversial one. Nauert joined the State Department only last year, and critics ask, what qualifications does the veteran news presenter have in politics and foreign policy? Unlike Nauert, Trump's nominee for Attorney General, William Barr, will not be faulted as an amateur. He has held this post for 2 years under President George H.W. Bush. Trump had wanted to fire Jeff Sessions ever since Sessions recused himself, effectively providing special counsel Robert Mueller free rein to investigate Trump's inner circle. Both Barr and Nauert will need to be approved by the Senate, which remains in Republican control after the midterms. At his confirmation hearing, Barr is expected to pledge that he will not interfere with the Mueller investigation, which has so far implicated 5 former Trump aides. Since taking office, Trump has overseen over 40 high-profile departures. The high turnover rate is unmatched by previous administrations. While the impact of the frequent changes might be up to debate, it is certainly piling up Trump's already full plate. On Wednesday, he held a contentious meeting with Democratic congressional leaders.
And I'll tell you what, I am proud to shut down the government for border security, Chuck, because the people of
the two sides couldn't agree on funding for the border wall, and a partial government shutdown on December 21st is looming.
For discussions about the latest with the White House, we are having in our Beijing studio Rick Dunham, co-director of the Global Business Journalism Program at Tsinghua University, earlier a Washington correspondent. In Washington, D.C., we have Joe Rubin, president of Washington Strategy Group, also former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Also in Washington, we are joined by Lester Munson, who's partner at the BGR Group, a government relation company. He also serves as adjunct faculty at Johns Hopkins University. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. 3 American gentlemen helping me and our audience all over the world to understand what exactly is going on in the White House right before the Christmas. So let me go to you, Mr. Rubin, about the latest discussion, quote unquote, taking place in the White House in front of the world. What do you make of it?
Well, thanks, Jen. It's quite remarkable still here in Washington to think that we can be surprised by anything, but yesterday was a surprise. And really to see the Democratic leaders debating with President Trump and Vice President Pence sitting next to him like a potted plant, basically, was a remarkable sight. And clearly right now the president is trying to figure out how to get leverage to move his agenda with Democrats poised to take control of the House. And he doesn't have much leverage, and I think that we're witnessing the sort of the collapse of strategy for the Trump administration when dealing with Congress, and that portends difficulties for the next 2 years for the administration.
Well, I understand, Mr. Rubin, you used to serve for the Democratic administration, so now let me go to you, Mr. Munson. I mean, some people say, well, when the Democrats watch some CNN and they talk among themselves, they got excited about things might be changing dramatically for the near future. We do not have popcorns, we do not stand in line from China's position between the two parties, but what exactly is going on from your perspective?
Well, I think I actually largely agree with Joel. This is going to be a very different 2 years starting in January with Democrats controlling the House of Representatives. I think, frankly, some Republicans are relieved because President Trump has always needed someone to fight with, and when Republicans controlled Congress, he fought with Republicans. Now he's demonstrated, even before Democrats take over, that he's willing to fight with Democrats for the things that he ran on, and building the wall with, between the U.S. and Mexico is the first thing on the list that candidate Trump promised before he got elected president. So I think in a certain respect it's entirely appropriate that he's fighting with the Democrats over funding for the wall. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this going forward. It's going to be very dramatic. There's going to be a lot of good television. It's going to be very entertaining for the American people. I think it's going to be public policy as entertainment going forward.
Entertainment and also concern, I guess, all come at the same time, right? Everything comes with a price. Mr. Dunham, from your perspective, of course, it's good TV, but at the same time, it is the budget that we are talking about here. December the 21st, supposed to be the deadline for a plan. Will there be a plan according to the recent drama?
That's an excellent question. There really is a bipartisan plan. It's just that Donald Trump doesn't like it. The bipartisan plan would give $1.3 billion in border security. He wants $5 billion. He wants specifically a wall. He's the one who is saying, I'll shut down the government if you don't give it to me. He said, I'd be happy to do it, which is the first time I've ever heard a president say that. So yes, there is a deal out there, but remember, even though he was fighting with Democrats in the Oval Office, Republicans control Congress, both houses of Congress, until the beginning of next year. And so right now he has to deal with Republicans to get his majority. A fight with Chuck Schumer doesn't do anything for him right now. When it comes to shutting down the government, he has to bargain with his Republican leadership.
Of course, Mr. Rubin, help us to understand further about the Republican leadership. There has been some reshuffling within the leadership itself. Paul Ryan, at the age of 50, already quote-unquote retired, as we all know. So President Trump now needs to deal with a mixture of both so-called the old and new when it comes to leadership. And how much will he be able to convince the other side to be on his side once again?
Yes, well, with Paul Ryan departing, it's another demonstration that the House Republican caucus is incredibly difficult to manage, and President Trump is going to have to really look in the mirror and decide what he wants to achieve for these next 2 years, because the Democrats in the House will have a significant majority, and in the Senate, the Republicans have a narrow majority, but many of their senators will now be up for re-election in just 2 years and in many competitive states. So will he, we use the word triangulate, will he try to cut deals with the Democrats in order to move an agenda, or will he take a more aggressive partisan position to try to demonstrate to his base that he is standing up for what they've elected him to achieve, and not really cutting any deals? And it's really, we're at a fork in the road, and for the president, with 2020 coming up, the presidential election,
right,
my sense would be that he's going to want to fight. We saw that yesterday in the Oval Office, but then the day after, fighting only gets you good headlines on TV. He still has to run the country. Otherwise, the entire enterprise will collapse, and the Republicans in Congress will be very concerned.
Well, Mr. Rubin, I mean, you are still holding on to the old Bible, I'm afraid, when you are saying that, because you have a president that do not necessarily, you know, have the same amount of concern about things that you have, possibly. Your priorities are very different from one another. I have to remind you, Mr. Rubin, about that cold fact, apparently.
Well, I agree with that, but he still is going to have to demonstrate to the voters who flip the House towards Democrats, the suburban voters in purple states, that he is worthy of a second term, and they want practical outcomes. And so I agree with you, personality-wise, completely, but in terms of strategy for winning the next election, if he doesn't appeal to that group, he's going to lose significantly, as will the Republicans in the Senate.
Yeah, but Mr. Munson, we've seen that the Republican leadership, for example, Mitch McConnell, earlier was, in a way, tried his best to explain President Trump's policy and try to persuade his constituencies to follow suit, and his colleagues as well. I mean, he is very politically matured, shall I put it that way, or experienced in Washington. So now he remains in the Republican Party leadership. Will he be continuing his earlier practice and way of doing things and make President Trump great again?
Well, it's a very good point about Mitch McConnell's maturity. We have a lot of maturity in congressional leadership now with Nancy Pelosi coming in as Speaker. She may have the most maturity of all of them. Chuck Schumer also has a lot of maturity. I think we need to be realistic here. Starting yesterday, really, this is about the 2020 election. And I take Joel's point that the president has to show he can run the government. But the entire enterprise is not collapsing. I disagree on that point. The government may shut down. The American people will see very little evidence of that, because the way we shut down the government here in the U.S. now, most of the government keeps running when the government gets shut down. It's a strange situation. What the American people actually care about at the end of the day is the economy, their jobs, and the financial situation of their families. And I think the president would be smart to let go of the immigration issue, which did not prove to be a winner in the election a month ago, and instead focus on the economy, where he has a track record of success, where employment in the U.S. is at an all-time high. Various groups within the society have a better economic position than they've ever had. The president should be talking about the economy. He should be talking about creating jobs. He should be talking about the relationship with China, where actually there's a bipartisan agreement on the U.S. taking a tougher approach. He has a much better story to tell. I think he should start telling it.
Mr. Munson, you probably have to help us to understand what does it mean when government shuts down in Washington, because you earlier indicated that even the government could shut down and the government is still running. So you might want to help us from this part of the world to explain exactly what you meant, and will it be that way?
So shutting down the government is a euphemism for saying that some parts of the government will not have funding after a certain date.
Right.
In reality, a lot of parts of the government already have funding for the rest of this fiscal year, and even those that don't necessarily have full funding have some reserve funds that they can use to get them through a pinch. The last time we shut down the government, the State Department, for example, was open for business the entire time the government was shut down.
When was the last time, though?
So while I don't think it's I think it was back in 2013 was a lengthy period. There may have been a day or two that were
the major
shut
one
down,
with Ted Cruz
last year.
Yes.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
the Ted Cruz shutdown, which, by the way, everyone criticized at the time, and a year after Ted Cruz effectively shut down the government, the Republicans took over the Senate. So the politics of shutting down the government have changed. It's not very evident to the American people if the government does shut down. Frankly, I don't think they care that much about it. I think what they really care about is the economy, their lives, their jobs, their future, their children. They care about those things. They're less concerned about funding the government. I'm not saying it's not an issue. I just don't think it's the end of the world. Okay, Mr. Rubin, I want to have your expertise back as well. Earlier, we heard Mr. Munson talking about the current president should really think about how to prioritize the issues when it comes to constituencies. To grab tightly to some, well, throw away the others. But Mr. Rubin, obviously, this president is trying to have all the options of issues juggling at the same time. He just wants to maintain as much control of those as possible for as long as possible until the very last moment to make the choice, isn't it? It seems to be his strategy, Mr. Rubin.
Yeah, this president seems to believe that he can negotiate through chaos and through the execution of chaos. And That's his approach, and at the end of the day, he makes pronouncements left and right and then ends up somewhere in a muddy middle. And we just saw in the past week and a half, the president said we spend too much on defense, we should cut defense spending. Then a couple days later, he says we should spend more on defense, we should spend $750 billion. Currently, we're spending about $720 billion. So it's chaos. It makes it very difficult for policymakers on Capitol Hill to navigate. The danger here is that the president's word has become so cheapened and so unreliable that for Congress, it's like negotiating with a wet noodle. We have seen this many times in high-stakes negotiations, and then nothing happens. The immigration debate, as Les points out, a year and a half ago or so, there was a potential deal, then it fell apart, and nothing has happened since. And so it's governing by tweet, and it's governing by chaos, and I think the American people are tired of it. We saw in these elections a record victory by House Democrats in terms of aggregate vote total. So the American people kind of voted their views of this governing style, and it wasn't very pretty for the president.
Well, as we all know, it's already starting the fight between the two parties for the presidential election, as all of you gentlemen beautifully illustrated at the very beginning of our discussion. Therefore, I go to you, Mr. Dunham, about that. Is this president, with a divided Senate and House of Representatives going to different parties, already become a lame duck anyway? And he is trying to struggling his way out of it, believing that he could make a difference, apparently.
Well, no one is a lame duck who could still serve for re-election. You're only a lame duck after you can't run again. I think he's a wounded duck. I mean, I think that the last election was a warning to him. But I have a slightly different view than Lester Munson. I think he actually needs to get things done. I don't think any tweets. I don't think chit chat and debate with the Democratic leadership is going to get him anything. I think he needs to deal with the issues, because good economies come and go. And the economy this past election was about as good as it's been in modern times, and Republicans had a historical setback in the House of Representatives. The economy could easily go into recession, could easily drop down. So I think he needs to do things, get legislative accomplishments, whether it's the economy or health care, do things for those forgotten people that he was running to speak for 2 years ago.
That's an important point, isn't it, Mr. Munson? I mean, the economy is doing very well. The world knows it. And the president is not making a secret to the rest of the world either. But as we see, the stock market fluctuates over the months. We see trade war apparently still going on. We also see some of the uncertainties, and no economy will always rise when it comes to the way it works. So, Mr. Munson, the next 2 years, some say, could be very unpredictable, particularly latter half of next year and leading up to 2020. So, Mr. Munson.
Well, I take the point that he's not going to get reelected by tweets, and I certainly don't think that would ever happen. But what the president does need to do is distinguish his record and his agenda from that of the Democrats. And he needs to make the case to the American people, and as Joel points out, particularly in the suburbs, which is the swing vote in this country, that his approach to the economy is the better one, that he wants less regulation, less taxation, more freedom, a tougher line with difficult trading partners like China, and that he is going to pursue those things aggressively. I think we've seen the limits of the immigration issue as a winner for President Trump. He arguably won on it in 2016. He's not going to win on it in 2020. We saw that last month. He needs to let go of that issue by and large and focus on the economy. There's going to be a limited number of things he can accomplish with the Congress, because Democrats are only going to go so far on the Hill in any kind of negotiation. So what the president needs to do is focus on the record he already has, on some things that he can do by executive order and on his own without Congress. And that's absolutely what he should be focusing on, is delivering for his voters and for the suburbs.
Right. Mr. Rubin, from your political experience and your reading of this president, together with the so-called consensus within Washington, how would you understand that? I mean, earlier Mr. Munson repeatedly suggesting that the president could be and could and will be possibly focused on some of the issues such as relationship with China and some of the others. In this part of the world, the people are very concerned that a president in the United States being further put into a political corner could, in a way, out of proportion, work on some of the issues as Mr. Munson just mentioned, including the U.S. relationship with China, which will be very dangerous for one of the most important bilateral relations in the world. So, Mr. Rubin, given your experiences in the State Department, how do you read domestic politics vis-a-vis the future choices?
So there's an expression we have, it's called wag the dog. It's when an American president is facing difficulties at home and sort of conjures up an international crisis to raise his popularity and avoid the downsides that he's experiencing. And so there's always that concern that the latter half of a term of a president, especially one where they don't have much authority over Congress, that they take unilateral action to raise global temperatures and make them, as the only commander-in-chief that we have in our system, more popular, more stronger. I don't think that necessarily works in this case. Americans are not excited about the idea of an aggressive war posture or of the trade war. Americans are not rallying to President Trump's side on that. And I would also want to mention that with Les's good point about running on the record, in many ways Democrats ran against the Trump record, not against the Trump personality, and they were very disciplined in this past election. And I think the Democrats are very energized about the record that President Trump is trying to execute, and that would be in many ways a gift to Democrats to talk about climate change and health care and other kinds of and economic inequities, the other issues that the president's been very bad on from a Democratic perspective. So there is a deep concern that he may try to do something irresponsible, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be popular for this president.
I see. And also, of course, we want to have Mr. Dunham's comments on this. You're living in Beijing most of the time, so you know the debate from the other side. Mr. Dunham, very briefly from you.
Well, I've been reading a lot coming out of Washington, and I think both Democrats and Republicans have been critical of China, and while Democrats don't necessarily agree with the approach of Donald Trump in this trade war, I think that Donald Trump could get some political benefit from continuing his criticisms of China. I mean, I think that's one of those areas where I think he will push, because I don't think many Democrats will push back.
Trump's team has never been stable for long, according to some of the latest media reports. For example, some core cabinet members have only been held their posts for a couple of months. Take a look at some of the timelines. John Bolton, National Security Advisor, began his tenure April 2018. Mike Pompeo took over the job of Secretary of State April this year, too. Also, few have remained since Trump's inauguration in January 2017. Some who have endured since their initial confirmation include U.S. Trade Rep Robert Lighthizer, who took office in May 2017, and Stephen Mnuchin, Secretary of Treasury, who started from February 2017. You see some of the key cabinet members. Of course, they do not agree, according to some media reports, among themselves as to how the country should articulate its own positions, especially some of the most important issues. Having said that, though, Mr. Dunham, help us to understand if the rotating of people has always been changing inside the White House. What does it mean for the president's authority within the cabinet, and also the diverse views within the cabinet to articulate eventually with a sound policy line?
I think the one common thread among these cabinet people and senior White House staff people he's brought in is personal loyalty. I think he's driven out a lot of the people who he didn't believe were loyal to him, but I think what he has is loyalists who disagree with each other. Secretary Pompeo, John Bolton, the Secretary of Defense Mattis, all have very different worldviews, and there's a lot of disagreement. There was a lot of disagreement. John Kelly had a lot of disagreement with the president on issues other than immigration. But I think I mean, obviously the White House is a very hard place to work. Donald Trump is a demanding boss. He's never responsible. The staff is always wrong if anything goes wrong. And so right now, his challenge is finding people who are high quality, who both know how to manage and know how to manage him.
All right. And Mr. Rubin, before we go, we have 45 seconds left. Your thought here, too.
Well, I completely agree. The president has demonstrated an inability to keep staff because he seems to be unable to manage effectively and communicate effectively about what he's trying to do and then let them do their jobs. And tweets coming out randomly, firing Jeff Sessions, who was his first supporter. It would be a very complicated, chaotic job to stay in this White House for the next chief of staff.
Mr. Munson, final words. We are probably losing him for now, but thank you so much, the three of you gentlemen, for joining us. Rick Dunham, Joe Rubin, Lester Munson, helping us understand Washington politics. Always very fascinating during this time of the year. Thank you.